The whole of Cedar Bend, Georgia, was certain Eula May Tatum had lost her good sense, because in the summer of 1992, while she was already drowning in her own bills, she sold the little house her grandmother had left her. Not to save herself, not to fix the roof that leaked over her own bed. She sold it to send a half-starved teenage boy nobody believed in off to trade school. People whispered. Some said she had thrown away the last thing of value she would ever own. Eula never asked the boy to repay a cent. She barely heard from him again. Then, 32 years later, just weeks before the county planned to sell the only thing she had left out from under her, more than 30 trucks came rolling up Sweet Gum Road, one after another, and what happened that morning left an entire town standing in the dust with its mouth open. A thick, wet heat lay over southwest Georgia that June morning in 2024. The pines along Sweet Gum Road stood perfectly still, not a breath of wind to stir them, and the cicadas had already started their long electric drone in the heat. The gravel lot in front of Maddie's kitchen shimmered. Heat rose off it in waves. Eula May Tatum was 58 years old, and the past few years had pressed down on her the way a slow drought presses down on a field. She stood 5'6", though she carried herself smaller these days, the way a person does when the world keeps telling them to take up less room. Her hands were strong and scarred from 40 years of cast iron and hot grease, and 1,000 mornings starting the grill before the sun came up. There was flour under her nails most days. Her hair was pulled back and going silver at the temples, and there were deep, kind lines around her eyes that came from smiling at people, even on the days she had nothing left to smile about. Folks in Cedar Bend knew Eula as the woman who fed you whether or not you could pay. Few of them knew how close she was to losing it all. She heard the engines before she saw anything. At first, she thought it was a logging convoy headed for the mill out on Highway 19. But the sound kept building, low and heavy, and then it turned off the highway and came up Sweet Gum Road toward her. She set down the dish towel and walked to the screen door. Through the haze she counted them. Service trucks. Flatbed trailers loaded with lumber and scaffolding, pickups pulling equipment, one after another, until they filled the gravel lot and spilled out onto the shoulder of the road. Eula's chest went tight, and only one thought came to her. The county. After all the certified letters she had been afraid to open, after the notice taped to her front door, she was sure of it. They had finally come to take the diner. To understand why a line of trucks could stop a grown woman's heart that morning, you have to understand what Maddie's kitchen was, and what it had cost her to keep it open. The building was old, older than anyone in town could rightly remember. Whitewashed clapboard gone gray, a tin roof streaked with rust, a hand-painted sign out front that Eula repainted herself every spring. Inside there were 9 tables, a long counter with 7 stools, and a kitchen that smelled of bacon fat and strong coffee, and the cedar shavings her grandmother had once scattered on the floor to keep it sweet. The booths sagged, the freezer hummed too loud, but people came because the food was honest and the welcome was real, and because Eula remembered the name of every child who walked in the door. For most of her life, the diner had been enough. It had raised her, it had buried her mother, it had carried her through a marriage that after 31 years had ended the way she least expected. She had married Roy Jeffers in 1991, a year before Wade ever walked up her road, and for a long time it had been a good enough marriage, the kind that runs on habit and shared work more than on fire. Roy helped around the diner when he felt like it, and complained about it when he didn't, and somewhere in the last decade the complaining had grown louder than the helping. He wanted her to sell. He had wanted her to sell for years, to take whatever the building would bring and move somewhere with air conditioning that worked and no 4:30 mornings. Eula would not, and the not selling became the wall between them that neither of them ever climbed. In the spring of 2022, Roy left. He did not leave in a fight. He left on an ordinary Tuesday while she was at the bank, and by the time she came home his closet was empty, and so was the savings account. What he left behind, she found out later, was worse than what he took. Years earlier, without telling her, he'd taken a second mortgage out against the building, $61,400, and spent most of it on things she never saw. The debt was in both their names. He was gone and the bills stayed. She did not chase him. She did not call a lawyer to ruin him, though more than one person told her she should. She simply opened the diner the next morning at 4:30, the way she always had, and made the coffee, and tried to figure out how to carry a debt she never agreed to. That was the thing about Eula May Tatum that people sometimes mistook for weakness. She would not waste her short, hard life setting fire to a man who had already burned himself. She had bread to bake. The numbers were not kind. The mortgage Roy had hidden came to $61,400. The county taxes were 2 years behind, $7,318.12. The walk-in cooler needed a compressor she could not afford, so she nursed it along, listening to it strain every night like a tired old man climbing stairs. Every month she paid what she could, which was never enough, and every month the hole got a little deeper. By that June, the county had set a date. If she could not bring the taxes current, Maddie's kitchen would go to the courthouse steps and be sold to the highest bidder. There were exactly 41 days left. There was a drawer in the back room, the bottom drawer of her mother's old desk, and it had become the place where Eula put the things she could not face. Certified letters from the county, the corners stamped in red. Statements from the bank that held Roy's hidden mortgage. A folded notice the sheriff's deputy had handed her in April, polite and apologetic, that she had read once and never again. She could not bring herself to throw any of it away, and she could not bring herself to open most of it either, so it sat in the dark of that drawer, growing the way a thing you refuse to look at always grows. Some nights, long after the last customer had gone and the grill had cooled, she would sit at the counter under the one light she left burning and feel the weight of that drawer in the next room, like a stone on her chest. It was not that Eula was a quitter. She had never quit anything in her life. It was that she was tired in a place that sleep did not reach. The diner still had its regulars, and they were the thing that kept her getting up at 4:30. Old Mr. Purnell, who'd had the same breakfast every morning for 19 years, 2 eggs over medium, grits and black coffee, and who left exactly $1.75 on the counter as a tip because that was what he could spare, and his pride would not let him leave less. The road crew that came through on Fridays. The widow Coley, who came not so much for the pie as for somebody to say her name out loud. Eula knew all of them, and they knew her, and on the good days the diner felt less like a failing business, and more like the last warm room in a cold house. But the good days were getting fewer, and the math did not care how many people loved the place. 41 days. That was the number that lived behind her eyes now, the way a fever lives behind your eyes. So when the trucks came, Eula May did not see help. She saw the end of everything her family had built. If you've ever stood in a doorway, watching something you love about to be taken, you already understand the silence she stood in. Hold on to that feeling, because the reason those trucks came has its roots in a single afternoon 32 years before, on a day so ordinary that Eula almost turned a hungry boy away. In the summer of 1992, Eula May Tatum was 26 years old. Her mother, Cleo, had passed the winter before, and the diner had fallen to Eula sooner than anyone expected. She was young to be carrying a whole business on her back, and she was tired in the way only grief and long hours can make a person tired. The roof leaked. The fryer was on its last legs. She was 3 months behind on the power bill, and pouring coffee with a smile that cost her more than anyone knew. He came up the road on foot one Tuesday in late July, in the worst heat of the day. Eula saw him through the front window before he reached the lot. A boy, tall and far too thin, walking slow like every step took something out of him. His jeans were stiff with road dust. His sneakers had split at the toe and were bound up with silver tape. The duffel bag over his shoulder had a strap held together with a bent paperclip. He stopped at the edge of the gravel like he wasn't sure he was allowed to come any closer. She went out to him, wiping her hands on her apron. Up close he was even thinner than she'd thought. Maybe 6 feet tall and barely 140 pounds, all knees and elbows and sunburn. His hair was the color of dry straw and badly cut, like he'd done it himself with kitchen scissors, but it was his eyes that stopped her. They were not lazy eyes, and they were not the eyes of a boy looking to take something. They were just tired. The kind of tired that no 18-year-old should have to carry. "You lost, baby?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, ma'am, I'm looking for work, any kind. I'll do anything." His voice came out cracked and dry. She studied him. "Where you coming from?" "Up near Valdosta." He looked at the ground, walking a few days now. The answer felt half-finished, and she let the silence sit until the rest of it came out. His name was Wade Carrick. His mother had married a man who didn't want another boy in the house, and one night an argument had ended with a door and a key turning. And that was that. He'd left with a duffel bag and $30-some, and the money had gone fast, and now he was just trying to keep moving, so he didn't have to sit still and think about it. "I don't need much," he said, "just a meal and maybe some work to earn it." Now, Eula May Tatum had every reason in the world to say no. She had no money to pay a worker. She had no business feeding a stray when she could barely feed herself. Common sense told her to point him toward the highway and wish him luck. But common sense had never been the only voice Eula listened to. She had grown up in a kitchen where her grandmother fed strangers as a matter of faith, and she knew what it was to be young and alone and afraid of the dark. She looked at this skinny, sunburned boy and she saw something she recognized. "You eaten today?" she asked. He hesitated, and that hesitation told her everything. "Come on inside out of this heat," she said. "I just took biscuits out the oven." She sat Wade Carrick at the end of the counter and put a plate in front of him, and then a second, and then a third, and she watched him eat the way a person eats when they have learned not to count on the next meal. He ate slow at first, like he was ashamed of how hungry he was, and then he gave up on being ashamed. She poured him sweet tea and pretended not to watch. When he finally slowed down, he looked up at her with his eyes shining and said, "Thank you, ma'am. I'll wash every dish in this place." He did too. He washed dishes until the water went cold, then heated more and kept going. The next morning he was waiting by the back door before she'd even unlocked it. And she put him to work, and Wade Carrick worked harder than any grown man she had ever hired. He showed up before light. He stayed until dark. He never asked for an easier job and never acted like any job was beneath him. But Eula noticed something about that boy within the first week. He did the kitchen work well enough, but his whole face changed when something was broken. The walk-in cooler that hummed too loud, the screen door that wouldn't close, the old neon sign out front that had been dark for 6 years. Those things called to him. He would stand and look at them the way some people look at a problem they were born to solve. One evening she found him out back with the guts of the cooler's compressor spread across a feed sack, cleaning each piece with a rag and an old toothbrush. By the next morning the cooler ran quiet for the first time in a decade. A week after that, he climbed up on a ladder with a coil of wire and a soldering iron he'd borrowed from the hardware store. And that night the neon sign out front buzzed and flickered and came to life, pink and humming in the dark. Eula stood in the gravel lot and looked up at her mother's sign glowing again after 6 years, and she had to turn away so the boy wouldn't see her cry. There was a night that summer that Eula never forgot. A bad storm had come through and dropped a pine limb across the porch of Miss Ozella Greer, 2 doors down, and she lived alone and had no one to clear it and no money to pay anyone. Wade heard about it at the counter, and the next morning before his shift he walked over with a borrowed handsaw and spent 2 hours in the heat cutting that limb into pieces, small enough for Miss Ozella to burn come winter. And then he stacked the wood neat against her shed and fixed to porch rail the limb had cracked. And he would not take the $5 she pressed on him. When Eula asked him why, he shrugged and said, "She fed me cornbread the second day I was here. I remember who feeds me." It was the kind of thing he never said out loud about Eula herself, but she understood that he was saying it about her too. He kept count of his kindnesses the way other people keep count of their grudges. That was the thing she came to love about that boy. In the evenings, after the diner closed, she started keeping him at the counter a while, before he went to his cot in the storeroom. She'd pour them both coffee and she'd talk to him, not about machines, but about everything else. About her mother, Cleo, and the way she'd run the place. About her grandmother, Maddie. Though she only told him the gentle parts then, the biscuits and the porch light, not yet the whole weight of what that porch light had meant. And Wade, who had grown up in a house where talk was something that turned into shouting, slowly learned to talk back. He told her about the stepfather and the door and the key. He told her, one night, looking down into his cup, that she was the first person in a long time who had looked at him like he was worth feeding twice. Eula reached across the counter and put her flour-scarred hand over his and said, "Baby, you were always worth that. The world's just been lying to you." He didn't answer, but she felt his hand turn over under hers and hold on. By August, she could see what was coming as plain as weather. The boy could not stay a dishwasher in a failing diner in a town with no future for him. He had a gift in his hands that would rust out and die in Cedar Bend, and she could not let that happen, not when she had the power to stop it, even if stopping it cost her the last thing she owned. She did not pray for an easier answer. She already knew the answer. She just sat with it a few more nights, knowing the whole time what she was going to do. Because sometimes the future of one young person is worth more than the most valuable thing you own. There was a vocational program 2 hours north in Macon that took in young men with no money and taught them the building trades. Carpentry, masonry, electrical, the kind of skills that a boy like Wade could turn into a real life. Eula called and asked about it, and the woman on the phone told her the cost of tuition and tools and a bed in the boarding house, and Eula wrote the number down on the back of an order ticket and stared at it for a long time. It was more money than she had. It was more money than she could borrow. She had exactly one thing in the world worth that much. Her grandmother, Mattie, had left her a little house on the side of town. 3 rooms and a tin roof and a porch where Eula had learned to shell peas at her grandmother's knee. Eula did not live in it. She lived in the back room of the diner. But that house was the last thing of her grandmother's that she could put her hands on. It was the place that held the smell of her, the sound of her humming. To sell it felt like burying Mattie a second time. She sold it anyway. She got $11,000 for it, less than it was worth, because the buyer knew she was desperate and Eula was too tired to haggle. And the day the word got around Cedar Bend that Eula May Tatum had sold her grandmother's house to send some white drifter boy off to school, people talked the way small towns talk. Some said she'd lost her mind with grief. Some said the boy had sweet-talked her. A few said uglier things, about a black woman giving up her own family's last piece of property for a white stray when half the families on her own street were hurting. Eula heard all of it. She kept her mouth shut and her chin up and her grill hot. The morning Wade got on the bus to Macon, she pressed a paper sack of biscuits into his hands and a little money for the road, and she told him the only thing that mattered. Don't you dare come back here a failure, you hear me? You go up there and you finish. A Tatum doesn't leave the pot half-cooked. He held on to her at the bus door longer than a boy his age usually would. And then he climbed on, and she watched the bus pull out onto the highway and disappear, and she walked back into the empty diner and made herself keep moving. For a long time, she heard almost nothing. A postcard here and there. She did not know how hard those first 2 years were for him, and he did not tell her, because he didn't want her worrying over a thing she couldn't fix. The truth was, Macon nearly broke Wade Carrick. The other boys in the program had families sending them a little something now and then. Wade had a duffel bag and a part-time job sweeping a body shop at night. He lived on day-old bread and instant noodles and the free coffee at the shop. More than once he went a whole day on nothing, so he could pay for a textbook he'd torn the cover off of buying it used. By the middle of the first winter, his money was simply gone. He sat on the edge of his cot, one cold January night with a tuition notice in his hand, and for the first time he let himself think the thought he'd been running from. He could quit. He could go back to swinging a sledgehammer on a demolition crew for cash and at least eat regular. Maybe everybody in Cedar Bend had been right. Maybe he had taken a hard-working woman's house and wasted it. 3 days later, a plain envelope came with a Cedar Bend postmark. Inside was a church bulletin from First Baptist, folded around 2 20s and a single dollar bill. $41. Eula had counted out exactly what she had in the coffee can that week and sent all of it. On the back of the bulletin, in her careful hand, she had written, "A Tatum doesn't leave the pot half-cooked. Once you light the fire, you finish the meal." "Don't you quit on me, Wade." He read it standing up, and then he sat back down and read it 10 more times. It was not the money, though the money kept the lights on that month. It was that she had nothing to spare and had sent it anyway. He knew exactly what that $41 had cost her. That night he made himself a promise that no matter how bad it got, he would finish what she had started in him. He folded that bulletin into his wallet, and it stayed there for the next 32 years. The first winter in Macon was the coldest Wade had ever been, in every way a person can be cold. The boarding house had a radiator that worked when it felt like it. He slept in his coat. He learned which church on Vine Street did a supper on Wednesday nights, and which grocery marked down its bruised produce after 6, and he learned to make a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter last 6 days if he was careful. The other boys in the program had people. They had mothers who mailed cookies and fathers who drove up on Sundays. Wade had a wallet with a church bulletin in it and a phone number for a diner he couldn't afford to call long distance. He worked nights sweeping out a body shop on the edge of town, and the owner, a gruff old man named Sal Petroselli, paid him $4.25 an hour and pretended not to notice when Wade slept in the office on the nights it was too cold to walk home. Sal was the second person, after Eula, to look at Wade like he might amount to something. The world, Wade was learning, was full of quiet people holding doors open for strangers. You just had to be desperate enough to walk through. He nearly didn't make it. That January night with a tuition notice in his hand was real, and the temptation to walk away from it was real. And then the envelope came with the $41, and Eula's careful hand on the back of the bulletin. And he stayed. He always told people, later, that she saved him twice. Once with a plate of biscuits, and once with 2 20s and $1 she could not spare. He finished near the top of his class in the spring of 1995. There was no family in the folding chairs to watch him walk, so he mailed Eula his certificate, and she framed it and hung it behind the register, where it stayed for 29 years. He hired on with a restoration outfit in Atlanta that specialized in old buildings, the kind most people wanted to tear down. He had a gift for it, the same gift Eula had seen in him at 18. He could look at a ruined thing and see what it had been and what it could be again. He worked 7 days a week. He learned everything, and in the fall of 1999, when a scaffold collapsed on a job site and put him in the hospital with a broken hip and 2 broken ribs, the doctor told him he might never do heavy work again. For weeks, Wade lay there frightened and furious, watching the life he'd built start to slip. And every morning he took that worn church bulletin off the bedside table and read it. "Don't you quit on me, Wade." He did his rehabilitation with the same stubbornness he'd brought to that cooler compressor at 18, day after day, until he walked again, until he worked again. By 2010, he had started his own company, Carrick Restoration and Builders. By 2024, it had grown into one of the most respected restoration firms in the Southeast, with crews working historic courthouses and churches and old main streets across 4 states. And whenever a young worker asked him where he'd learned to never walk off a job half done, his mind always went back to a hot kitchen in Cedar Bend, a grandmother's house he'd never seen, and a black woman who had believed in him before he had any reason to believe in himself. Now, here is the part of the story that Eula May did not know, and that Wade Carrick himself was only beginning to learn. Because the diner she was about to lose was not just a diner. It was something far older and far more important, and the secret of it was hidden inside the very walls she was praying she could keep. The truth started with Maddie, Eula's grandmother, back in a Georgia that most people would rather forget. In the years when Maddie Tatum was a young woman, a black family could not simply get in a car and drive across the South. There were towns you did not stop in after dark, towns with signs at the city limits that meant exactly what they said. There were thousands of miles of highway with no gas station that would sell you fuel, no restaurant that would serve you a plate, no motel that would rent you a bed, no matter how much money you held in your hand or how tired your children were in the back seat. For a black traveler, an ordinary trip could turn deadly between one county and the next. So Black America built its own map. From 1936 until the late 1960s, a man named Victor Hugo Green, a postal carrier from Harlem, published a small green-covered guidebook. He had started it for the New York area, and then, as letters poured in from travelers all over the country, expanded it to cover nearly the whole United States. It listed the places, town by town, state by state, where a black family could safely eat, sleep, and fill their tank. Restaurants, boarding houses, beauty parlors, and barber shops. Gas stations that would let you use the restroom, and private homes, called tourist, where ordinary people, very often women, opened their own doors to strangers passing through because there was nowhere else for them to lay their heads. That book, the Negro Motorist Green Book, was passed hand to hand and kept in glove boxes across the country, sold in black-owned stores and at Esso stations, and for millions of people, it was the difference between a safe journey and a dangerous one. It was, in the plainest sense, a list of people you could trust on a road designed to make you afraid. Victor Green wrote once that he looked forward to the day his guidebook would no longer need to exist. That day came, more or less, after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 made it unlawful to turn a traveler away because of the color of his skin, and the last edition was printed not long after. But the danger had been real, and the courage of the people who answered it had been real. And most of their names were never written down anywhere a stranger could find them. Maddie Tatum's place in Cedar Bend was in that book. The building that was now Maddie's kitchen had once been Tatum's tourist home and cafe, and from 1949 until the law finally changed, it was a green dot on that map, a safe harbor on a long, dark road. Travelers who could find nowhere else to stop would turn off the highway onto Sweet Gum Road. Drawn by the porch light, Maddie kept burning all night, and she would have a hot plate and a clean bed waiting, and she would not turn anyone away for money. She kept a ledger, a thick black book, and in it she wrote down every soul who came through her door. The name, where they were headed, what she fed them. And beside the names of those who could not pay, she did not write a debt. She wrote 2 words, paid in full. Eula had grown up hearing pieces of this, but she had never seen the ledger, and over the long years of grief and bills and survival, the old story had faded into something half-remembered, a thing her grandmother used to talk about. She did not know the book still existed. She did not know it was sealed up behind the wall of the back room where she slept every night. And she had no idea that, in the summer of 2024, a historian 200 miles away was about to come looking for exactly that. If you followed Eula this far, stay with her, because everything is about to turn, and it turns on a stranger, walking through her door with a clipboard. Dr. Imani Hughes was a public historian at a university in Atlanta, and for 3 years she had been driving the back roads of Georgia documenting what was left of the Green Book sites. It was painful work, mostly. Of the hundreds of places that had once been listed, the great majority were gone. Bulldozed for parking lots, burned, forgotten, replaced by gas stations and dollar stores, their history erased without a marker, without a memory. Dr. Hughes was racing the clock, trying to find and record the handful still standing before they too disappeared. She had a list of addresses from the old editions of the book, and in June of 2024, her list brought her to Sweet Gum Road in Cedar Bend, Georgia. She walked into Maddie's kitchen on a Thursday afternoon, ordered coffee and a slice of pie, and got to talking with the woman behind the counter. When she learned that the woman's name was Tatum, and that her grandmother Maddie had run the place since before the war, Dr. Hughes set down her fork and got very quiet. "Mrs. Tatum," she said carefully, "do you know what this building was?" Eula told her what she remembered, the tourist home, the travelers, the hot plates for folks who had nowhere else to stop. And Dr. Hughes opened her laptop and turned it around on the counter, and there it was. A scanned page from the 1956 edition of the Green Book, and on it, in plain type, the listing. Tatum's Tourist Home and Cafe, Cedar Bend, Georgia. Eula May read her family's name in that book and her hands began to shake. But even as her heart was lifting, the bell on the door rang, and a man in an expensive suit walked into the diner, and the lifting stopped cold. Because the man was Reginald Day, and Reginald Day had been making Eula's life very difficult for the better part of a year. Reggie Day was 57, a developer out of Albany who had grown up poor right there in Cedar Bend before he made his money and moved on. He wore good shoes and a watch that cost more than Eula's truck, and he had a way of smiling at you while he looked past you at the value of your land. For Reggie, Maddie's kitchen was not a piece of history, and it was not anybody's grandmother. It was a corner lot at the junction of Sweet Gum Road and the new highway interchange the state was planning, and a corner lot at an interchange was worth a great deal of money to a man who knew what to do with it. Reggie had been quietly buying up the parcels around the junction for 2 years, leveraging himself to the eyeballs with a regional bank, betting everything on assembling enough land to sell cross-truck stop chain called Crossland Travel Centers. He had nearly all of it. He needed Maddie's corner for the entrance, and he had been pressuring Eula to sell, gently at first, then less gently. He had even gotten to her cousin. Darnell Tatum was Eula's second cousin, 41, and drowning in debts of his own, and Reggie had found him and made him an offer. Talk your cousin into selling before the county takes it for nothing. And there's a finder's fee in it for you. Darnell had told himself he was helping. He had sat at Eula's counter more than once that spring, telling her the diner was a sinking ship, that she was a fool to go down with it, that Reggie's offer was a mercy. Eula had heard a version of those words before, 32 years ago, when the whole town told her she was a fool. She had not listened then either. "Eula May," Reggie sits now, sliding onto a stool without being asked. "I heard the county set your date. 41 days, isn't it? I'm trying to do you a kindness here. Sign with me this week and you walk away with something in your pocket instead of nothing on the courthouse steps." He set a folder on the counter and tapped it. "This building's just old wood and rust. Let me put it out of its misery and we both move on." just old wood and rust. Dr. Hughes, sitting 2 stools down with the 1956 Green Book still glowing on her screen, turned and looked at Reginald Day for a long moment, and something in her historian's heart went very still and very determined. Eula did not raise her voice. She never did. She picked up Reggie's folder, set it back in his hands, and said, "This building fed people who couldn't get fed anywhere else for 100 miles. My grandmother kept folks alive in here. I'm not signing it over to be a gas pump." Reggie shook his head the way a man shakes his head at a stubborn child, and he left, and the bell rang behind him, and Eula's hands were still shaking, but not from fear anymore. That afternoon, after Reggie had gone, Dr. Hughes stayed. She explained to Eula what the listing might mean. A confirmed Green Book site, still standing, still run by the founder's own family, was rare almost to the point of impossible. It could be eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. And here was the thing that mattered most. The thing that would soon bring Reggie Day's whole house of cards down without anyone laying a finger on him. The new highway interchange that made Reggie's land so valuable was being built with federal highway money, and any project using federal money is required by law to take historic properties into account before it can move forward. If Maddie's Kitchen was determined eligible as a historic site, the federally funded interchange could not simply pave over it. The truck stop's whole entrance plan would have to be redrawn. Or stopped. Eula listened and slowly understood, and for the first time in 2 years, she felt something she had almost forgotten how to feel. She felt the ground steady under her feet. What neither woman knew yet was that Wade Carrick was already on his way. It had happened like this. Dr. Hughes, in her years of work saving Black historic buildings, had crossed paths more than once with restoration contractors, and the best of them in that part of the country was Carrick Restoration and Builders. When she got back to Atlanta that night, fired up about a Green Book cafe in Cedar Bend, run by a Tatum woman who was to lose it to the county, she made a few calls to see if anyone in her network might donate the restoration work the building would need to qualify. One of those calls reached Wade Carrick's office. His project manager came to him with it the next morning. "A Green Book site," she said, down in Cedar Bend, run by an older woman named Eula May Tatum, about to be lost to back taxes and a developer. Wade Carrick set down his coffee and did not say anything for a long moment. That night he sat alone in his office, after everyone had gone home, with his worn leather wallet on the desk in front of him. Inside it, soft as cloth now, was the same church bulletin she had mailed him in 1992. The ink had faded, but he could still read it. "Don't you quit on me, Wade." He had not seen Eula May Tatum in 32 years. He had built an entire life on a foundation she had laid with her own hands and a house she had sold, and he had let the years and the shame of how far behind his thank you had fallen carry him away from her. He had always meant to go back. He had always been too busy, or too afraid she'd think he'd waited too long. He picked up the phone and told his financial people to quietly find out exactly how much trouble she was in. 2 days later, the answer came back in a folder an inch thick, and the deeper Wade read, the more silent he got. The hidden mortgage Roy had left her. The back taxes 2 years gone. The developer circling the corner like a buzzard. The compressor on the walk-in she'd been nursing long years because she couldn't spare the money to fix it right. The county's date 41 days out. Line after line of a proud woman quietly going under, and nowhere in any of it, not once, was there a record of her asking a single human being for help. He read it twice. Then he set it down and stood at the window for a long time, watching the lights of Atlanta, thinking about a hot kitchen and a third plate of biscuits and the smell of cedar shavings on an old wood floor. He thought about how many times in 32 years he had told himself he would go back, and how the going back had always slid to next year, and next year until the boy she'd saved had become a man with 4 states of work and a fleet of trucks and no excuse left except the oldest one, which is that we are most ashamed in front of the people we owe the most. Then he made his decision. No phone call, no letter, no check in the mail, which she might have been too proud to cash anyway. Some debts you do not settle from a distance. After 32 years, it was time to go home, and he was not going to go alone. He walked out to the main floor where his crews were closing up for the night, and he told his project managers to clear the schedule, because the whole company was about to take a job in a town none of them had heard of, for a woman who had no idea they were coming. Which brings us back to that wet June morning and the line of trucks coming up Sweet Gum Road. And Eula May Tatum standing frozen in the doorway, certain the county had come to take her diner. The convoy turned into the gravel lot and stopped. 31 trucks. Doors opened. Men and women in work shirts climbed out and started unloading scaffolding and lumber and toolboxes, and a generator coughed to life, and not one of them came toward her with a clipboard or a padlock. By now neighbors had drifted out onto their porches, all up and down the road, and a few had walked over to the fence line to watch, because in a town like Cedar Bend a thing like this travels faster than the trucks did. Some of them thought the bank had come. Some thought a company had bought the place out from under Eula at last. Nobody knew. Then a dusty silver pickup eased through the gate and parked near the front steps, and the driver got out. A man around 50, broad through the shoulders, gray coming in at his temples, with the careful, weathered hands of someone who had worked with them his whole life. He stood there a moment looking at the old building. At a sign Eula repainted every spring, and then he looked at the woman in the doorway. For a few seconds neither of them said anything. Then he smiled, and it was a smile she had seen before, a long time ago, on the face of a starving boy who'd just been handed his third plate of biscuits. "Miss Eula," he said. "It's Wade." The coffee cup slipped out of her hand and broke on the floorboards. She stared at him. Her mind would not connect this solid gray-templed man in front of her with the skinny, taped-up boy who'd walked up her road in 1992. And then it did, all at once, and the years fell away, and she came down off that step faster than her knees had any business letting her, and Wade Carrick crossed the lot and caught her up, and the two of them held on right there in the gravel with the whole road watching. Several of the neighbors at the fence had to look away and wipe their faces. Dr. Hughes, who had come back that morning to start the historic paperwork, stood by her car with her hand over her mouth. When they finally let go, Wade walked back to his truck and lifted out a wooden frame and brought it to her. Inside the glass was a photograph from the summer of 1992. The two of them standing in front of the diner, Eula's arm across the skinny shoulder of an 18-year-old boy, both of them squinting and grinning in the heat. And taped beside the photo was a single dollar bill, soft and yellowed, with 2 faded 20s, and the church bulletin, the words still just readable. "Don't you quit on me, Wade?" Eula put her hand to her mouth. "I forgot I ever sent that," she whispered. "I never did," Wade said. "Miss Eula, I read those words every hard day of my life for 32 years. You didn't just feed me. You gave me a whole future, and I came to give you yours back." For the rest of that summer, the crews of Carrick Restoration worked Maddie's kitchen from sunup to dark. The gravel lot that had sat half empty for years was full again, full of the sound of saws and hammers and men calling to each other over the generators, full of the smell of fresh-cut pine and hot tin and primer. They jacked the building level and replaced the rotted sills. They re-roofed it with standing seam tin like the original, the same silver-gray Maddie had chosen 70 years before. They rebuilt the sagging booths in the front porch, rewired the whole place down to the last outlet, and dropped in a new walk-in cooler that ran so quiet Eula kept opening the door at night just to make sure it was still on. They stripped a century of paint off the front of the building, layer by layer, and under all of it, faint but readable, they found the ghost of the old hand-lettered sign from her grandmother's day. Tatum's Tourist Home and Cafe. Wade had a sign painter come and restore it stroke for stroke, and he hung it beside the new one, the old name and the new name keeping each other company over the door. Eula stood in the lot one evening and watched the last of the sunlight catch both signs at once, and she had to sit down on the new porch steps and put her face in her hands. 40 years she had kept this place breathing on grease and stubbornness, and now strangers were making it beautiful. And she did not know what to do with that much kindness all at once. Whenever Eula tried to thank Wade, or asked what all this was costing, he only smiled and changed the subject, and she began to understand that the trucks and the repairs were not the whole of what Wade Carrick had come to do. The day they uncovered the secret was a Tuesday. A crew was opening up the back wall of the room where Eula slept, the one that backed onto the kitchen to run new electrical. Behind the plaster and the old horsehair lath, sealed up inside the wall, they found a tin bread box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside it was a thick black ledger, its spine cracked, its pages soft with age, and a small green-covered book that Dr. Hughes recognized before anyone touched it. A 1956 edition of the Green Book itself, with the corner turned down at the Georgia page. They laid the ledger out on the counter and opened it, and the whole crew went quiet. Page after page of names in Maddie Tatum's hand, going back to 1949. where folks were headed, where they'd come from, what Maddie had fed them. And beside hundreds of those names, where another person might have written an amount owed, Maddie had written the same two words over and over for 20 years. Paid in full, paid in full, paid in full. Dr. Hughes turned the pages slowly, reading the names aloud, and that was when the second secret came out, the one that would matter most of all. Because more than a few of those names were Cedar Bend names. Local families who had fallen on hard times and been quietly fed on credit Maddie never collected. And on a page dated the winter of 1971, in her grandmother's careful hand, was an entry that made Eula May set her hand flat on the counter to steady herself. The Dye family. 4 children fed through the cold months, and beside it the same 2 words, paid in full. Reginald Day, the man who called this building Old Wood and Rust, had been one of those 4 children. As a boy, he had been kept from going hungry by the very woman whose memory he was trying to bulldoze. Word of the ledger went around town the way everything went around Cedar Bend, and the old folks started coming. They came in the evenings, after the crews had gone, drawn by the same porch light Eula had started leaving on again, and they sat at the counter and told her the things her grandmother had never bragged about. Miss Ozella Greer, who was 83 now and had known Maddie her whole life, told about the night in 1962 when a young preacher and his family, run out of a town 2 counties over, with nothing but the clothes on their backs, had found Maddie's porch light on at 2 in the morning. Maddie had fed them and hidden their car in her shed and sat up with a shotgun across her knees until dawn, then sent them on safe with biscuits and a full tank she'd paid for herself. She wasn't scared of nothing, Miss Ozella said, her voice shaking. Or if she was, she never let it stop her hand. Dr. Hughes sat through those evenings with a recorder running and tears she didn't bother to wipe, because this was the history she had spent her life chasing, and here it was, walking in the door one old neighbor at a time. There were more. A man named Curtis Boyd, 79, who as a boy of 9 had ridden with his family from Florida to Detroit in 1955, 3 days on the road, and remembered his father gripping the wheel through the sundown counties and the relief in the car when they saw Maddie's sign glowing through the dark. A woman named Geneva Whitfield, who had been born in the back room, because the nearest hospital that would take a black mother was 40 miles off, and the baby would not wait. A traveling music teacher whose car had thrown a rod on the highway in a county where a black man walking after dark could get himself killed, and who had walked 6 miles toward the only light he could see, and the light had been Maddie's. One after another, the stories filled up that little diner, and Eula understood for the first time the true size of the thing her family had quietly done, and the true size of what she had almost let the county sell on the courthouse steps. She had thought she was fighting to save a diner. She had been fighting to save a monument that no one had ever bothered to mark. Now stay with this story, because here is where the man who thought he held all the cards watched them fall out of his hands, and not one person had to push him. Reggie Day did not go quietly while his plan was still alive. Once the trucks arrived and the talk of historic registers started going around, he came back to the diner one more time, and this time the easy smile was gone and there was something harder underneath it. He found Eula behind the counter and he did not sit down. "You think a plaque is going to feed you?" he said low, so the customers wouldn't hear. "You think this fellow from Atlanta is going to keep writing checks forever? I'm offering you real money today, and you're spending it on paint and old stories." He leaned in. "That land is worth more than your whole family ever made off this dirt. Be smart for once." Shula set down the coffee pot. She was not a woman who raised her voice, and she did not raise it now. "Reginald," she said quietly, "you keep saying this is just dirt, just old wood. But my grandmother kept a roof over folks in this building when the law and half this state wanted them dead. There's a name in the old ledger we found in that wall, a family she fed for nothing through a hard winter a long time ago." She looked at him steadily. "I'd be happy to show it to you sometime, when you're ready to see it. Some things are worth more than what you can sell them for, Reginald. You're a smart man. It's a shame nobody ever taught you the difference." Reggie's jaw worked. Something flickered behind his eyes, like a man who half suspects what's coming and would rather not. He turned and walked out, and the bell rang behind him, and that was the last time he came to threaten her. The next time he came, months later, he came in the cold with nothing left, and she fed him, Dr. Hughes filed the paperwork to have Maddie's Kitchen determined eligible for the National Register as a confirmed Green Book site, And with the ledger and the original guidebook and the living testimony of half the old folks in town, that determination came fast. And the moment it did, Reginald Day's grand plan began to come apart by the simple operation of its own weight. The highway interchange that made his land so valuable was federally funded, and a federally funded project cannot harm an eligible historic property without a long, costly review. With Maddie's Corner now protected, the truck stop's whole entrance had to be redesigned, and the redesign was going to take years and add millions in cost. Crossland Travel Centers, the chain Reggie had been about to sell his assembled land to, sent their own people down to do their due diligence before they closed. And their people found something Reggie had been very careful to bury. 2 years earlier, Reggie had quietly paid for an environmental study of the parcels he was buying. The study had turned up petroleum contamination in the soil, left behind by an old filling station that had operated next door to Maddie's back in the 60s, its underground tanks leaking into the ground for decades. Cleaning it up would cost well over $400,000. Reggie had taken that report and locked it in a drawer, planning to sell the land fast and let the problem become somebody else's before anyone went looking. But Crossland's people went looking. They found the contamination on their own, and then they found out he had known about it all along and said nothing. The deal collapsed. Crossland walked away, and then their lawyers came after Reggie for fraud, for selling them on land he knew was poisoned and historically tied up both. And the regional bank that had lent Reggie everything against the promise of that truck stop sale, when it saw the deal die and the lawsuit start, called every one of his loans at once. The man who had spread himself across a dozen over-leveraged parcels, betting on one big payout, had no payout coming and no way to cover the loans. Within 90 days, Reginald Day lost nearly all of it: the land, the bank's faith, the shine. He lost it the way he had tried to make Eula lose hers on the courthouse steps. And the bitter joke of it, the part nobody in Cedar Bend missed, was that he had buried himself with his own buried report. No one took revenge on Reggie Day. He had simply built his fortune on the belief that you could hide the truth and grind down what other people loved, and the truth does not stay buried, and the things people love have a way of being stronger than they look. But that is not where Eula May Tatum left it, and the way she left it is the part of this story I think about the most. A few weeks after Reggie's deal fell apart, Wade asked Eula to ride into town with him. He'd been secretive for days, and every time she asked, he just said, "One more thing, Miss Eula. Just one more thing." They drove to a small brick law office near the square that belonged to an attorney named Sandra Pinckney, who had spent her whole career fighting for families losing land they couldn't afford to keep. Inside on the table were folders. Sandra slid a thick stack across to Eula and asked her to read. The first pages didn't make sense to her. Legal language, account numbers, the kind of paper that had only ever brought her bad news. The second pages even less. And then she reached the last document, and she read it twice, and she stopped breathing. The mortgage Roy had hidden, the $61,400, satisfied. The back taxes, the $7,318.12, paid in full. The foreclosure, withdrawn. The county's date, the date that had lived behind her eyes for 2 years, simply gone. For the first time in her adult life, Maddie's kitchen belonged to Eula May Tatum, free and clear. No bank, no county, no debt, no quiet drawer of letters she was afraid to open. Her hands started to shake, and then her shoulders, and Sandra Pinckney came around the table and held her, while she breathed the kind of cry a person holds back for years, and then can't hold back one more minute. She lowered the papers and looked at Wade, and the only word she could find was, "Why?" Wade reached into his jacket and took out the soft folded bulletin he had carried for 32 years, the 2 20s and the single dollar still tucked inside it. He laid it on the table between them. "Because of this," he said, "I read what you wrote me on the back of this every hard day of my life. Every job that almost went under, every time the bank said no, every morning in that hospital when the doctor told me I was done." His own voice was none too steady now. "You spent your grandmother's house on a boy nobody wanted, Miss Eula, and you never once asked me to pay it back. You wouldn't even let me try. So I waited until you couldn't stop me." He smiled through it. "The least I could do was make sure you never have to be afraid of losing this place again. You finished the meal you started in me. I'm just here to finish the one you started in this building." Eula put her hand over her eyes, and for a long while the lawyer's office was very quiet. And outside on the square the ordinary afternoon went on, and not one person passing by on the sidewalk knew that inside that little brick office, a 32-year-old debt was being settled the only way such debts can ever be settled, which is forward, never back. Then there was the matter of Reginald Day. By the fall, Reggie was a different man to look at. The good suits were gone, the watch was gone, the easy smile was gone. He had moved into a rented room over on the east side of town, the same poor side he'd grown up on, and most folks in Cedar Bend would cross the street rather than speak to him. One cold evening he came and stood outside Maddie's kitchen in the dark, not coming in, just looking through the lit-up window at the place he had tried to destroy. Eula saw him out there. She did not call the sheriff, she did not lock the door. She went and opened it and said, "It's cold. You eating?" He stood there a long moment in the cold, and then he came in and the warmth of the place and the smell of the kitchen hit him the way it must have hit a 4-year-old boy 53 years before, though he didn't know that yet. She sat him at the end of the counter, the same end where she'd sat a starving boy in 1992, and she put a plate in front of him without a word. Fried chicken and rice and greens and a square of cornbread and a tall glass of sweet tea. And while he ate, slowly, not looking up, ashamed in a way that went all the way to the bone, she set the old ledger on the counter beside his plate. She turned it to the page from the winter of 1971, and she put her finger on the line and let him read it himself. The Day family, 4 children, fed through the cold months, and beside it in Maddie Tatum's careful hand, the same 2 words she had written beside so many names. Paid in full. Reggie Day stared at his own family's name, written there more than half a century before, in the handwriting of the woman whose memory he had tried to pave over for a profit. His mother's name. His own as a small boy, fed for nothing by the grandmother of the woman he had called a fool in the building he had called Old Wood and Rust. Something inside him that had been hard for a very long time finally cracked all the way through. He put his head down on the counter of the diner that had kept him alive when he was a hungry child, and he wept, the way grown men weep when they finally run out of places to hide from themselves. Eula did not say a word against him. She did not say, "I told you so." She refilled his sweet tea and let him be, and after a while she said the only thing worth saying. "She'd have fed you tonight too, Reginald. That's the whole point of her you never understood." That mercy did more to the man than every lawsuit and every loan the bank had called. You cannot stay proud, it turns out, in front of proof that you were loved before you ever did a single thing to earn it. Darnell, her cousin, came around too. He gave back the finder's fee he'd never quite spent and asked Eula's forgiveness, and she gave it, and she put him to work helping run the kitchen, and he turned out to be steadier than anyone expected when somebody finally believed he could be. A year later, on a warm Saturday in the spring of 2025, Cedar Bend gathered at Maddie's kitchen for 2 things at once. The first was the unveiling of a bronze marker by the front steps, naming the building to the National Register of Historic Places as a Green Book site, one of the few left standing in all of Georgia. Dr. Imani Hughes spoke, and she told the crowd the real history, the dangerous roads and the green-covered book, and the ordinary people, so many of them women, who had turned their own front doors into safe harbors and never asked for credit. Children who had never learned this in any classroom stood and listened, and that mattered, because the surest way to lose a history is to let it go unspoken. The second thing they gathered for was the opening of something new. With Wade's help, Eula had set aside the little house Carrick Restoration had built behind the diner, and over its door hung a sign. The Maddie Tatum Welcome Fund. Its purpose was the simplest thing in the world. Every year it would take in a handful of young people with nowhere to go, the kind nobody else would bet on, the way nobody had bet on a skinny boy in 1992, and it would feed them and house them and pay for them to learn a trade. The first one to walk through that door was a young woman named Tamara, 19, with a baby on her hip and no place left to turn, and Eula May Tatum met her on the porch and said the same thing her grandmother had said to strangers for 20 years, the same thing she had said to Wade. "Come on in out of the heat, baby. I just took biscuits out the oven." Eula stood up to speak that day, 59 now, her voice slower than it once was, her hands not as steady. She looked out at the crowd, and she saw something she finally understood. She saw, in face after face, the same hunger and the same hope she had seen in Wade Carrick's tired eyes on the worst day of his young life. And she understood, after all those years, that the most valuable thing she had ever given away was not her grandmother's house. It was not a meal or a job or $41 in a coffee can. It was a chance. 32 years before, she had planted one small seed in the life of one boy nobody wanted, and that seed had grown into a thing whose shade was now falling on people she would never meet. Here is what I keep coming back to, sitting with this story. The whole town once thought Eula May had thrown her last possession away on a stranger who could do nothing for her, that she'd made a fool's bargain. But a fool's bargain and an act of faith look exactly alike from the outside. The only difference is time, and most of us never get to see the difference, because the seeds we plant with our small kindnesses tend to come up in fields we never walk through. Eula didn't sell that house expecting 31 trucks to ever come up her road. She sold it because a boy was hungry and gifted and out of options, and she had the means to help him. And that was the whole of it. The help was the point. The return was never the point, and the man who tried to bulldoze her, Reggie Day, did not fall because anyone schemed against him. He fell because he had built his whole life on the belief that you could hide the truth and grind down the things other people love. And that is a foundation that gives way under its own weight every single time. The dignity of a place and of a people turned out to be stronger than a corner lot at an interchange. It usually is. We just don't always live long enough to watch it hold. I'll say plainly that Eula May Tatum and Wade Carrick and Maddie's Kitchen are not real people, and Cedar Bend is not a real town. This is a story, and I wrote it as one. But the Negro Motorist Green Book was real. Victor Hugo Green was real. And the thousands of real black families, so many of them, women running cafes and rooming houses and opening their own front doors, who kept strangers safe and fed on the dark roads of this country for 30 years, and asked for nothing in return. Every one of those people was real, and most of their names were never written in any history book the way Maddie wrote hers in that ledger. If this story moves you, the kindest thing you can do is go and learn the real history behind it. It is more remarkable than anything I could invent. Maybe you're in a hard season right now. Maybe you've done some quiet good for someone and wondered if it ever mattered, or wondered if it'll ever come back around to you. I can't promise you 31 trucks. But I believe the way Eula believed that no real kindness is ever wasted, even the ones we never see bear fruit. We plant in one season and the shade comes up in another, and often it isn't us who gets to sit in it. That doesn't make the planting foolish. It makes it faith. If this story touched you, tell me in the comments about one who once gave you a chance when you had no way to repay it. If you're still waiting on your own breakthrough, leave a word and let this community lift you up. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and pass this story along to someone who needs to be reminded that what they did in the quiet mattered more than they'll ever know. May God bless you, your family, and your road ahead. And may He make us all a little more like the kind of person who keeps the porch light on for a stranger. We'll see you in the next one.